Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Saibono Discovery Center. Learners, today we are going to do some revision pertaining to the Cold War, basically the origins of the Cold War. But what we'll be doing first is we'll be doing how you should answer source-based questions. Then thereafter, we will be moving into some of the content. We'll only focus on one part of the content, which is the letter part. And then we'll be going through a question paper. And as you will be going through a question paper, we'll be answering some questions that you might have difficulties. So let's move straight into how you should interpret historical information with regards to source-based questions. Pertinent that we understand that each question, take note, that in history we write paper 1, we write paper 2. Paper 1 consists out of section A. Section A is question 1, which is what we are doing currently now. We are dealing with it. And that is the origin of the Cold War. Then we find question 2, which is Angola. Then we find question 3, which is civil rights movement. Then in paper 1, we move over to what we call section B. Section B, it's question 4, which is Vietnam. Question 5, which is Congo. Question 6, which is Black Power movement. Then we move over to paper 2. Paper 2 is section A, also similar to paper 1. Section A, question 1, internal resistance in South Africa. Question 2, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It is abbreviated as TRC also. Then question 3 is what we call globalization at large. Then section B, question 4, which is Steve Biko, the Black Conscious Movement within South Africa. Then we move to question 5, which is the road to democracy. Then question 6, by paper 2, it is what we call basically Gorbachev's reforms, how it influenced Eastern Europe and South African politics at large. So that is a brief synopsis of paper 1 and paper 2. So now we are dealing only with question 1. Now, each source-based question consists of 3 cognitive levels, which is called level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 1, it's basically extractions from the sources. You must organize relevant information. Then, at the same time, you must define historical concepts. So when we say define historical concepts, we'll go into detail pertaining to how to define a historical concept. It means you must explain a definition. So when we look at the weighting is 30% and 40 marks. When we go to level 2 is what we need to interpret the evidence from the different sources. We must basically explain information from sources. Then you must analyze sources at the same time. So level 2, it is basically a combination of interpretation and analyzing of the different sources. And the mark allocation, it's 20 marks and the weighting is 40%. Then you move to level 3. Level 3 is what we call, you must be able to interpret, you must be able to evaluate information from the sources. You must engage the sources to determine, is the source useful? Is the source reliable? Are there any limitations pertaining to the different sources also? Then you need to compare the sources and you must find the differences. Differences means the contrast between the different sources at the same time. Then the last level 3 question is the paragraph question. And we can see that level 3 is 16 marks. So level 1, 14 marks, level 2, 20 marks, level 3, 16 marks. So when we add it all up at the end of the day, it gives us 50 marks. So that means now, paper 1, we have question 1, which is 50 marks. Question 2, which is also 50 marks. And we have question 3, which is 50 marks. That is now what we call section A, basically. Then we move over to section B. Section B, question 4, it's 50 marks. Now, section B is what we call the essay question. Section A is what we call the source-based questions. Then we 5, 50 marks, 6, 50 marks. From the 6 questions, you are supposed to answer 3 of them, and that will give you a total of 150. So we understand now when we look at the different cognitive levels, it only focuses on the source-based questions basically. So learners, no one is supposed to get less than 14 marks. Why? Because it's extractions from the source, meaning now the only one that is not in the source is your definitions. So it means now if you know your definition, and then you will be able to get 14 marks because you know your definitions. So this is why it's pertinent that you study your definitions, because if you don't study the definitions, then you will end up with 12 marks. So that now, basically, in order to pass the source-based questions, you must at least get in the region of 25 marks, basically, and then you're on the safe side, basically. So this is pertaining to the source-based questions, which we are going to deal with. So it's pertinent that we understand that how the question is basically set up. Now let's move over to level 1 questions. Level 1 questions require you to extract information from the sources and define historical concepts. These questions carry a maximum mark of 4 marks, basically. When we look at the mark allocation, it says 1 times 1, 2 times 1, 1 times 2, 3 times 1, 4 times 1. Then the question verbs are as follows: list, quote, identify, name, mention. Then we find how the questions are being set up. So it is called typical questions, basically. What information in the source tells you about, what according to the source, quote 2. So when you look at information in the source, what according to the source, quote. So the minute you begin to see these words in your own words, now you will be able to understand that this is a level 1 question, meaning now it consists out of 14 marks. 12 in the source, 2 marks, it's a definition. So that within itself informs me that I can't get less than 12. If I know my definition, it means I will get 14 marks at the end of the day. Now let's move over to level 2 questions. Level 2 questions requires you as the candidate to be able to analyze, to interpret, and engage the different sources to find the answer. The maximum mark is basically 4 marks. And as we can see here, this is the maximum mark. It says 2 times 2 equals 4, basically. But we find 2 times 2 equals 2 at the same time also. Then the question verbs are as follows. So when we talk about question verbs, when you see these words, it will inform you that it is a level 2 question. So when you see explain, when you see comment, when you see describe, when you see organize, this is what we call question verbs at large. Then typical questions, how the questions are being phrased. What message does the cartoonist convey? And normally this one is 2 times 2, which will give us 4 marks, basically. Explain in the context of, what do you think? It can also be what is implied at the same time, and comment on the source, basically. So now we clearly understand that level 2 questions equals to 20 marks, basically. Then let's move over to level 3 questions quickly now. Now, level 3 questions require you to explain a different perspective of sources. You must draw conclusions. How reliable, how useful is the source? And with regards to the limitations, are there any limitations within the source? These questions, they carry a maximum mark of 2 times 2, which gives us 4. So level 3 questions are never less. Let me write here, never less. So it means now they are never less than 2 times 2. Those are level 3 questions. Now the minimum mark is 4 marks and the maximum mark is 8 marks, basically. And the question verbs are compare, contrast means difference, comment, justify, and they are phrased in the following fashion. Explain to what extent the evidence in 1A, compare the evidence of source 1A and B, comment on the usefulness, how reliable is the source, and they can also ask you, explain the usefulness or how reliable is the source, explain the limitations in the source at the same time also. Then let's look at the mark allocation. We can see The numbers in front informs us the amount of answers we need to provide. Then the number at the back informs us the amount of marks that will be allocated for the answers that is provided. So we can clearly see in front the amount of answers. This one, the one that's second, will actually indicate to us the amount of marks you will receive, basically. Then if you see a mark allocation of 2 times 2, this is an interpretation, or you must be able to analyze this question, meaning you must have studied your content. So what is the content? Basically, the content is what we call your own knowledge. So the content is what we put inside our memory bank, and the minute it's in the memory bank, now it becomes knowledge. So it means now it is how you have received the content, and that is what we call own knowledge at the end of the day. Now, remember, learners, you must look at the mark allocation. After reading the question, you look at the mark allocation, and that will indicate to you the amount of answers that you must provide, basically. Then we find different types of level 3 questions. How do sources support each other? So compare, contrast, it is basically you are comparing the different sources. The one part, compare, means the similarities, how similar are the sources, and the other part is the differences, basically. Then we need to look at how reliable is the sources, the usefulness, and the limitations, basically. Now let's look quickly how we should answer similar when we compare the sources. How does source 1A support 1B? Then they name the topic that we're dealing with. This question is asking you how the two sources are the same. How are they similar? So what do you do? How do you answer? What do you do means how do you answer this particular question? You go to source 1A and you find something in that source that is supported, says, shows something that is in source B. It means something that is similar. For instance, you must write the answer down as follows. Take note, you must write the answer. In your answer, you should say in source 1A says there are apples, and this is supported by 1B, which shows us the apples, and that will give you 2 marks. Now you need to go back to 1A again. Source 1A says there are cars, and this is supported by 1B, which shows us the cars. Now, learners, if it is the same thing, if it is cars and apples, now we use the word both. It means both sources informs us there are apples. Both sources informs us there are cars. Only when the words are the same. If it is a similarity, all right, it means it is the same. But we find synonyms. Synonyms means the meaning is the same, but the word is different. For instance, in 1A says the people are aggressive, and 1B supports it because we are seeing the violence of the people. So now we have aggression and violence. It's similar things, and they are what we call synonyms at the end of the day. So when it is synonyms, then you say in source 1A says, but if it is the same words in both sources, then we say both sources informs us they are apples. Both sources informs us they are cars, basically. So these are only examples that I'm using, basically. So when we come to contrast, what do? You say source 1A says there are cars, and this is contradicted by 1B, which says, remember now, if it is a visual source that you see, like a cartoon, a photograph, that's what we call a visual source. If it says it's a written source, and 1B says there are trains. So now, what are the contradiction? 1A says there are cars, and 1B says there are trains, basically. Then we go back, and you need to go find to separate now what's in 1A that's not in 1B, basically. And that's how you answer, basically, contrast and supporting. Then we go to how reliable are the sources. You need to ask yourself 2 questions first. Is the source accurate? Can the source be trusted? Those are the 2. Now, if it is accurate, we are talking about the date, we are talking about the author, we are talking about where did you find this particular material. Then to get to the answer, now you must look at who wrote the source. That is the first part of your answer. Who wrote the source? When was the source made? The date, basically. Why was it created? It means the meaning. You must extract now using the word paraphrase. What does paraphrase mean? Paraphrase means you cannot copy paste it as is. So when I say you cannot copy paste it as is, it means you cannot write it down from the source as it is in the source. It means you must add certain words, but the meaning must be there in that particular answer. Is the evidence in the sources consistent with evidence from other sources? It means can it be corroborated, basically. So let's move over to usefulness. So when we look at usefulness, the questions that should lead us to answer this particular question is, remember I said usefulness and reliable are asked in two ways. Comment on the usefulness, comment on how reliable, comment on the limitations, or explain the limitations, basically. So when it comes to usefulness, the first thing that we need is the source accurate. Does it mean what it says? Can it be corroborated? Corroborated means, can it be linked to other sources? Is it saying what other sources are saying at the same time also? Who produced it? So when I look at these questions and I look at the reliable questions, it's almost answered in the same fashion, basically. Then let's go to limitations. Limitations, the first thing that we need to look at is the bias, is the source bias. So what is bias? Bias means it focuses on one side. Like with this topic, we are dealing with the Cold War. So there were two superpowers involved in the Cold War. It was USA and USSR. So USA, United States of America, USSR, it is the Soviet Union or the Russians at large, basically. So now, if the information in the source is from the USSR side, what does it mean? The source is biased because it only gives us one country's viewpoint. If the author of the source is from USA, it's biased because it only gives us information from the USA side, basically. Then we need to look at, is there a date? We need to look at, is there author? So these are the things that we should write down. There's no date. There's no author. There's no mention of an author. The source is not authentic because it was retrieved from the internet. So that's important. The things that are coming from the internet are not always it cannot be trusted. Why can't it be trusted? Because why? It comes from the internet. There must be the authors must be there. The dates must be accurate. And when was this source actually started at the same time? Then we move over to the last level 1, level 3 question. It is a paragraph. This question is worth 8 marks. We use a rubric to assess this particular question. How it's being set up, how it's being phrased, explain the role, impact, causes, effects, or significance of a particular historical event. The paragraph questions always relate back to the key question. The paragraph question requires you, the candidate, first to interpret, evaluate, and use the evidence in the sources as your answer. And this is how they actually phrase it. Using information from the relevant sources in your own knowledge. Now take note, I said own knowledge is what you have been taught in class that's in the memory bank. So when you answer the paragraph question, you need to utilize the own knowledge that you have been taught in the class. Now let me further explain how you should answer this particular paragraph question. Read through all the sources and underline the relevant facts as you answer 1A. You underline what's answering the key question. Remember, our key question is the paragraph question at the same time also. Then you must transfer these facts to a clean page. It means on the answer sheet. Do not copy directly from the source. It means paraphrase. Paraphrase means you add certain words, but the meaning must not lose its focus. Very important that we understand the meaning must not lose its focus. A mere rewriting of the source will result in 0 marks. Take note, you copy the source as is, you will receive 0 marks. You must be able to paraphrase in grade 12. Remember, other content that relates to the question that comes in where we talk about own knowledge, content from your textbook and taught within class, that is own knowledge at the same time. Then write in paragraph form. So the structure cannot be this bullet form. If it's bullet form, then you will basically not receive the full 8 marks, but you will be brought down basically to 2 marks, and that's the maximum marks that you will receive, even if your answer is 100% correct pertaining to the information. So all you need to do is write down the relevant information by paraphrasing it, and then you point out the relevant facts from that particular. Now, do not write more than 3/4 of a page. Very important. You cannot write the whole page when it comes to the paragraph question as such. Now, this is the structure of question 1. We can basically see that it is being spread. So when we look at this is source 1A. So when we go to 1.2, this is 1B. This is 1D. So which one is missing here? 1C. So it means now the different levels has been spread across, because we can clearly see that in 1A, there are basically, when we look at the mark allocation, which is this here, there are 4 marks. When we move over to now to 1B, we can clearly basically see there are 6 marks there. And then D, there are 4 marks, which gives us the 14 marks. So now we can see how it's being spread. So when we go to the level 2 questions, which starts by 1.1.3, we can clearly see that this is 1A, this is 1B, this is basically 1C, which was omitted basically. Now the question is, so when we look at this basically, now we see that this gives us the 20 marks. When I add all this up, it gives me the 20 marks. Then I move over to level 3. We can see that level 3 is 16 marks. So this is basically the structure, how the different levels are spread across this question 1 basically. Now let's quickly move over to what we call the content of the Cold War, how the Cold War actually started. So we first need to look at examination bullets. The examination bullets is basically what is going to guide us. So our focus today will be the Berlin crisis. But the first bullet talks about after the end of World War II, how the Cold War developed. The second bullet talks about USSR and USA and the creation of interest, installation of the Soviet-friendly governments in satellite states, US policy of containment, Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and what is not mentioned here is the other containment policies of USSR, which is the Molotov Plan, which is the Comecon. But our focus today will be the Berlin crisis that started 1949 to 1961, then the opposing military alliance, NATO and Warsaw Pact. And we will not be looking at who was to blame for the Cold War at large, basically. Then let's go through a few concepts just to familiarize ourselves pertaining to the concepts. Communism, what is communism? It's an economic system that advocates a class. So when we talk about advocate, it means it creates a classless system. It means there's no poor, there's no rich, in which property is owned by the state and production is shared equally amongst the people. So it's simple layman's term. There's no classes in communism. There's no profit making. All means of production belongs to the state. That is communism. And communism is what we call both, it's a political system and an economic system, basically. That is what communism is all about. Now, the opposing part to communism is what we call democracy, which is a political system. So democracy is a political system and capitalism is the economic system. So these two run as one basically, but it's split up. Democracy is a political system, capitalism is an economic system. Now, what is capitalism? Capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership. It means now the government only interferes through taxation. It means there are private owners and the government only interferes through taxation. Then the political system for capitalism is democracy. It's a system of government in which leaders are chosen by the people through a system called election. So you can now clearly decipher which system is being implemented in South Africa. Is it communism or is it democracy, basically? Then we move over to containment. What is containment? It's a policy introduced by USA and USSR to basically USA introduced the containment policy to stop the spread of communism. USSR introduced their containment policy to ensure that their countries do not become capitalist countries. Then the Iron Curtain. What is the Iron Curtain? It's a symbolic border. Take note. Others will say it's an imaginary border, but it's a symbolic border between that is separating Eastern Europe from Western Europe, separating communist bloc from capitalist bloc at the same time, basically. Now, these are only just a few concepts pertaining to the origin of the Cold War. Now, let's look at the development of the Cold War. First, it was 3 conferences. The first conference is not there by number 1. It was the Iran Conference, which was in 1943. The Yalta Conference, Potsdam Conference was in 1945. At their re-conference, they asked, the big 3 asked, which was Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, they asked Stalin to help repair the countries in front of Russia, in front of USSR. It was agreed upon that you would do it and you will not implement communism within those countries. Then that was in 1943. The war was still in motion. The war started, Second World War started 1939 and it ended 1945. So 1945, in February, they met in Yalta. At Yalta, it was agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 zones: British zone, USA zone, and French zone, and they were the capitalists. Then the communists was only 1 zone, and that was the USSR zone. Now, why did they decide to actually divide Germany into 4 zones so that Germany cannot become unified? Because after World War I, Germany became unified, and which resulted in World War II, basically. Because the Germans were highly upset after World War I because they had to repair all the countries that was involved in World War I that was damaged because of the war. So after the Yalta Conference, it was the Potsdam Conference. And the Potsdam Conference, it's basically where what we say that the conflict, actually, the Cold War conflict sparked, basically. Look, the Cold War was already in motion after 1917 when Russia became a communist country under the leadership of Lenin. Vladimir Lenin became the leader and he implemented communism in 1917. Already there, capitalism was shifted one side and communism actually took over in the USSR. Then at Potsdam Conference, Roosevelt passed away. Winston Churchill was no longer the leader, so Roosevelt was replaced by Harry Truman. Then Winston Churchill was replaced by Attlee. Then Stalin was the only one left from the big 3 countries, basically. Then at Potsdam Conference, they continued with the notion Germany will be divided into 4 zones. But then Stalin came up with something. He wanted reparations in the sum of $20 million in order to repair all the damages done by the Germans within Russia. And Harry Truman opposed that, and that now resulted the spark of the Cold War now. So what happened after the Potsdam Conference, now the USA had to develop what we call containment policies, which is the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Truman Doctrine, any country could ask. So what was the Truman Doctrine all about? The Truman Doctrine was providing military and financial aid to any country that needed it, basically, after the war. Marshall Plan was only for European countries, and that was only financial aid at large, basically. Yes, USSR also adopted what we call containment policies, and those containment policies were it was information to find out which countries wants to become capitalists, and the other one was Molotov Plan, Comcon, which provided finances and they had to pay back what interest. With the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, you could pay back whenever you had the money. And up until today, some countries are still paying back because of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Then we are moving, what we are going to deal with today is the Berlin Blockade. So now we can clearly see that the Berlin Blockade had two factions. It is basically the Berlin Blockade. It was because of the introduction of the Deutschmark, basically, within West Germany. Now take note, the capital was in the Soviet zone. And as the capital was within the Soviet zone, what does it mean now? It means you control the capital, you control the country. So what happened is the capital was divided also in 4 zones: British, French, USA zone. But the 3 zones became one zone, which was called West Berlin, and East Berlin belonged to the Soviet Union. And because of the Deutschmark that was introduced within West Germany, it was also introduced in West Berlin. And because of that, it spread into East Berlin. And because of that now, Stalin decided, listen here, we need to now actually block off all the roads leading where to? All the roads leading to West Germany. And because he blocked off all the roads leading to West Germany, what happened is that lasted for 11 months. And what transpired basically is that the West, take note, West capitalists, they had over 200,000 flights over the 11 months, which transported basic necessities, basically. Then the second last point is the military alliance, NATO and also PAC. Then the last one is the Berlin Wall. Take note, the Berlin Wall is the last. So we will be focusing basically on the Berlin Blockade today and the Berlin Wall that was erected at the same time. So let's go into the Berlin crisis, the first part of the Berlin crisis. So Berlin crisis is where Stalin blocked off the road. That is the first part. The second part is the Berlin Wall. So we are going to look at the first Berlin crisis. So the Cold War tension extended to Berlin, and that started 1948 to 1961. So the Soviet zone had communist dictatorship as well as communist economic system. Like I said to you guys earlier, communism is a political system and an economic system. And it grew extremely slow because all means of production belongs to the state. It means all profits go to the state, basically. So the Western zone had democracy. So West Berlin now, which remember, learners, that Berlin was in the heart of the Soviet zone. So the capital was divided into West Berlin and into East Berlin. So the West zone had democracy, free enterprise, economic practice, rapid economic recovery, and a new currency, basically. Then, because of the new currency that transpired, West Berlin was not far from the Western zone of Germany. So Stalin was angry because the currency was used in the whole of Berlin, basically. So West and East Berlin used the same currency, which was called the Deutschmark. He believed the West was making its dominance in the whole of Berlin. In June 1948, he closed all roads linking Berlin to West Berlin, and that was called the Berlin Blockade, basically. So what was the Berlin Blockade all about? Stalin cut off Western Berlin to try to persuade citizens to agree to the Soviet control. The West decided to launch a Berlin airlift, which resulted in over 200,000 flights over the 11 months. They flew in food, fuel, building material, medical, basic necessities also. In 1949, the blockade ended and land routes were reopened, basically. Then why was the Berlin Wall built now? Now take note now. Since 1949, after the Berlin blockade, 3 million Eastern Germans fled to the west. Take note now. Berlin in the middle of the Soviet zone. So they enter into East Berlin and they filter into West Berlin. From West Berlin, they fly out and they fly into West Germany at large, basically. Then they wanted a higher standard, a better standard of living, and they wanted more freedom because under communism, there are a lot of restrictions. By mid-1961, 10,000 people per week were leaving the East Berlin side, the East Germany side. So East Germany wanted to prevent the loss of people and skills. So it means a lot of the skilled people left East Germany, basically. Now take note, The three zones, USA zone, British zone, and take note, USA zone, British, and the French zone, they amalgamated and they became what we call West Germany. And the USSR side, they became what we call East Germany. So in August 1961, Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin died already in the 1950s. Nikita Khrushchev became the leader in the late 1950s, and they built what we call the Berlin Wall, basically. Then what transpired is there were military wings also that was started. And the first military wing that was started was NATO. NATO was the military wing for the capitalists, for the democratic countries, basically. So it was actually congregated, it was actually built up by all the countries, and South Africa was part of NATO. South Africa basically is still part of NATO also at the same time. Now, it's pertinent that we understand that this is what we call the content of the Berlin crisis, basically. But we need to understand that the Berlin crisis had two sides. The first one was the Berlin blockade. The second one was the Berlin Wall. Learners, let's go for a break. On our return, we will be dealing with a question paper. Thank you. Welcome back, grade 12 learners, to today's history lesson with regards to the origin of the Cold War. Our focus is the Berlin crisis, the Berlin blockade, and the building of the Berlin Wall per se. But let's go quickly into what we call a question paper, and then we will actually go through what I've discussed earlier, how to answer source-based questions, basically. So question 1 is the question that we are dealing with, and we are going to read what we call the key question. The key question is always next to question 1. So this is for each question, question 1, question 2, question 3, there's a key question, and the key question is your paragraph question also the same time. So how did Berlin become a focal point of Cold War tension between the Soviet Union and the United States of America in 1948, basically? Now let's go to the first source. This source below is the source 1a. This source below is an extract from a book titled The Berlin Wall, How It Rose and Why It Fell, 1992. It highlights the arguments that were reached by the victorious powers regarding the administration of Germany after the Second World War. Let's go into the source. That was the caption I was reading, basically the heading or the caption. Even before the guns of war were silenced, the European adversaries commissioned a group formed by the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had begun to plan for an occupation of Germany. At that time, it was decided that Germany would be divided into 3 zones, one for each country except France. Remember what I spoke about 4 zones, but now we can see it says it was first 3 zones, then France was not included at the initial start. Then later at a conference held in February 1945 at Yalta, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill were able to convince Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, to create a zone for the French also, which had suffered 3 invasions and 2 defeats at the hands of Germany within 7 years. Each of these 4 zones would be administered by the country occupying the area, basically. On 12 April 1945, President Roosevelt died, and the presidency of the United States of America passed on to Harry Truman. On 17 July 1945, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin met at Potsdam near Berlin. It was at this meeting that the final decisions were made regarding how Germany should be organized and where its borders would be drawn. The Allies agreed on a border in the west. A temporary line for the east was to be the Oder and western Nasse River. Each occupying country had to ensure that the Germans were not able to build up a military force again. The city of Berlin, 110 miles inside the eastern zone of the Soviets, became a special area for joint power control. Before the Soviet army officially took control of its zone, there was a last-minute rush of people from east to west Berlin. They feared that the Russians would establish a more secure border, one that would be impossible to get through, basically. Now let's go to the questions being posed for this particular source. Identify in the source the 3 countries that made up the European adversary commissions, basically. So when I go back to the source, the question is identify 3 that made up this, basically. So the first question being asked, if it's not a definition, the first answers are always found in the first 4 lines, basically. And when I look at the question and I look at the source, I can clearly see where the answer is, basically. It says identify in the source the 3 countries. So when I go back and it says the 3 countries. So now in the second line, United States of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. So let's see if the answer is correct, basically. And there we have it, basically, United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. So now we can see the first question that's always being asked, if it's not a definition, it's in the first 4 lines, basically. Now let's go to the next question. Why, according to the source, was it decided at Yalta in February 1945? It also created a zone for the French in Germany. Now look at the mark allocation. It says 1 times 1 equals 1 basically. When we look at the top one, it says 3 answers, but 1 answer, no, but 1 mark each. So when we look at the answer of 1.1.2, it says Roosevelt and Churchill were able to convince Stalin to create a zone for the French, which had suffered 3 invasions and 2 defeats at the hands of Germany within 7 years. Now remember now, this is what we call a extraction. These are extraction. You just remove it from the sources as is. And we can see here it is because it is removed from the source exactly. There's inverted commas. So we can see the inverted commas when we answer questions like this. But the key here is, why was it decided at the Yalta conference? That's the key. To create a zone for France, basically. So we need to underline the keywords, and we need to look at the mark allocation, and that will inform us how the answer should be structured, basically. So let's go to the next question. 1.1.3. Explain why you think the occupying countries had to ensure that the Germans were not able to build a military force again. Take note, occupying countries, keyword, to ensure that the Germans were not able to build a military force again. So those are the key words. When you look at the mark allocation, it means 1 answer, but it will receive 2 marks at the end of the day. So let's look at the answers that are provided, basically. When we look at the level, it's a level 2, meaning you must interpret the evidence. So when we say interpret the evidence, it means now the answer is not in the source. You must say what it actually means, basically, because this is what it says here. Explain why you think. So take note, when they say explain why you think, it must be in context of the topic that you are dealing with. So the answer is to prevent Germany from attacking its neighbors in the future, prevent expansion in Eastern Europe, basically. Germany was blamed for having caused the Second World War, and it had to be weakened, basically. Then Germany brought economic misery to the whole of Europe to maintain peace in Germany. Any other relevant responses, for example, to ensure that Germany does not become unified, that will create World War III, basically. Now let's go to the next question, 1.1.4. Comment on the implications of having the city of Berlin in the Soviet zone in the context of the Cold War tension between USSR and the USA in 1948. Mark allocation means 2 times 2, meaning we need to provide 2 answers. 1 mark will receive 2. It will be 4 marks, basically. Let's look at the answers that are provided. The first one, the city of Berlin will become a pawn that the Soviet Union would use to settle the differences with the Western powers. So this receives 2 marks, basically. Then the next one, let's go to the next answer. The city of Berlin will become isolated from the Western powers as it was surrounded by the Soviet zone. 2 marks. So now we can just stop there. But there are more answers. Western powers were concerned that the decisions taken for the city of Berlin might be dominated by the Soviet Union to prevent the spread of capitalism, basically. So the key here is, it says comment on the implications. So we look for the implications of having the city of Berlin in the Soviet zone. It means the implications. So we're looking at the implications. What difficulties did it bring because it was in the middle of the Soviet zone? So bullet number 3 talks about, it says Western powers were concerned that decisions taken for the city of Berlin might be dominated by the Soviet Union. And this is why they had to occupy Berlin, because in politics, if you control the capital, you control the country at large also. Then any other relevant responses is needed, basically. Let's go to source 1B. 1B, let's read the caption first. The source below is an extract from the Berlin Crisis, a report on the Moscow decisions, 1948, by the U.S. Department of State, delivered to the representatives of the USSR in Washington, London, and Paris on 6 July 1948. It indicates the USA's reaction to the Berlin blockade. Let me read the source to you. The governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France decided to make formal representation to the government of the USSR blockade measures as a clear violation of existing agreements concerning the administration of Berlin by the four occupying powers. The United States government categorically firmly asserted that it was in occupation of its sector of Berlin with free access thereto as a matter of established right derived from the defeat and surrender of Germany and confirmed by the formal agreements among the principal allies. The United States also empathically, forcefully declared that it would not be induced, it means push, by threats, pressures, or other actions to abandon these rights, basically. Let's continue with the source. I'm reading in the source. I'm not reading the caption again. This consideration, together with responsibility for the physical well-being of the population of its sector of Berlin, including hundreds of thousands of women and children, obliged, meaning forced, the United States to insist that in accordance with existing agreements, the arrangements for the movement of freight and passenger traffic between the western zones and Berlin be fully restored. The United States emphasized again its willingness to settle by negotiations or by any of the other peaceful methods provided for in the Article 33 of the Charter of the United Nations. Specifically, the United States offered once blocked of measures were lifted to participate in negotiations in Berlin among the four allied occupying authorities. Basically, let's go to the question first. Define the term blockade in your own words. So now we can clearly see what 1B, it says define the term. So the first question is define the term. So it means that you must have studied the definition per se. When you look at the mark allocation, it says 1 times 2 basically. And this is the answer basically. The answer is sealing, closing off a place to prevent goods or people from entering or leaving. Now take note, the key here is own words, not in context of the Berlin crisis per se. Then preventing freedom of movement from one place to another, placing obstacles to hinder one's path. Then let's go to the next question. 1.2.2, explain why you think the USA regarded the Berlin blockade as a clear violation of existing agreements, considering the administration of Berlin. So again, why do you think? Meaning interpretation, you must be able to analyze the question. The mark allocation is 2 times 2, and this is supposed to be 4 marks basically. Now let's look at the answer that is being provided here. The USA saw the Berlin blockade by the Soviet Union as a deliberate act of bringing poverty to Berliners. The USA saw the blockade as a decision that the Soviet Union took without decisions with deciding with other countries at large. The USA saw the Berlin blockade as a threat to the administration of its zone. Any other relevant responses? Now take note. This is 2 marks. 2 marks. So once you have got the 2 marks, basically 2 answers, it's 2, 2, 2, and it gives you the 4 at the same time also. Let's go to the next question. 1.2.3, quote 3 reasons from the source why the USA was determined to remain as a power in Berlin. Key quote 3 reasons. So when we look at quote means copy paste, it means write it down as is. Mark allocation 3 times 1, meaning provide 3 answers, and the answers are as follows. Regarded the blockade measures as a clear violation of existing agreements concerning the administration of Berlin by the 4 occupying powers. Second one, so this is 1 mark, 1 mark. As a matter of established right derived from the defeat and surrender of Germany, confirmed by formal agreements among the principal allies. Third one, would not be induced, pushed by threats, pressured, or other actions to abandon these rights, responsibility or for the physical well-being of the population of its sector of Berlin, including hundreds of thousands of women and children. So there we have our 3 answers, but we have more than that, basically. And that means there cannot be any other answers but only these ones here. Take note, the inverted commas, There's one there. There's one there. So as we go right through, we can see the same pattern is being followed at large also. Let's go to the next question, 1.2.4. State one specific obligation according to the source, which the USA insisted on concerning the physical well-being of the population of its sector in Berlin. Mark, you look 1 times 1. So state also level 1 question basically. And this is an extraction. Then in accordance with existing agreements, the arrangements for the movement of freight and passengers traffic between Western zones and Berlin be fully restored. So the key here is state 1, specific obligation. It says where in the source, which the USA insisted on concerning the physical well-being of its population, basically. Now let's go to the next question, 1.2.5. Comment on why the USA emphasized its willingness to settle any disagreements with the USSR by negotiations. Mark your location 2 times 2, meaning interpretation. You must analyze this particular question, basically. Answer is as follows. The USA was not prepared to engage in any military conflict with the USSR. The USA was a founding member of the United Nations organization that supported settlement of disputes by negotiations. Then the USA was a signatory to the Charter of the United Nations that called for settling issues through the negotiating process. Now, take note, learners, this will be 2 marks. This will be 2 marks, 2 marks, 2 marks. And all we need is basically just 2 answers. 2 times 2. From the 4 that's currently there, we just need 2 answers, basically. Then there's a 5th one also, which will be also 2 marks. So the USA did not want to lose its occupation of West Berlin. Any other relevant responses. But from the 5 that is provided, we only need 2, basically. Now let's go to source 1C. The source below, dated 14 July 1948, is a Soviet Union response to the United States. Note sent to the Soviet Union representative on 6 July 1948. It outlines the steps the Soviet command would take to protect its control over Berlin, basically. Now let's read the source together. Berlin lies in the center of the Soviet zone and it's part of that zone. The interests of the Berlin population do not permit a situation in which in Berlin or only in the western sectors of Berlin there shall be introduced special currency which has no validity in the Soviet zone. Moreover, the carrying out of a separate monetary financial reform in the western zones of Germany has placed Berlin and the whole Soviet zone of occupation in a situation in which the entire mass of currency notes which were cancelled in the western zone threatened to pour into Berlin and the Soviet zone of occupation of Germany. The Soviet command has been forced, therefore, to adopt certain urgent measures for the protection of the interests of the German population and also of the economy of the Soviet zone of occupation and the area of Great Berlin. The danger of the disruption of the economic activity of the Soviet zone and the Berlin has not been eliminated even at the present time, in as much as the United States, Great Britain, and France continue to maintain in Britain their special currency. Furthermore, the Soviet command has consistently displayed and is displaying concern for the well-being of the Berlin population and is assuring them of normal supply in all essentials and is striving, take note, striving for the speediest elimination of the difficulties which have arisen recently in this matter. In this connection, if the situation required, the Soviet government would not object to assuring by its own means a adapt supply for all Greater Berlin. Basically, let's go to the questions. Source 1C, 1.3.1. Give 2 reasons according to the source why the Soviet Union opposed the introduction of a special currency to be used in West Berlin. Take note, it says give 2 reasons. When you look at the mark allocation, we see the 2 there. It says 2 times 1. And what do we look for? Why the Soviet Union opposed the introduction of a special currency where in the western part of basically this is supposed to be the western remains there, but the eastern part of Berlin. So they wanted it to remain in the western part of Berlin and not move over to the eastern part. So this is how we should interpret this question, but it is an extraction that comes directly from the source. First answer, Berlin lies in the center of the Soviet zone. The interests of the Berlin population do not permit a situation in which Berlin, or only in the western sectors of Berlin, there shall be introduced a special currency which has no validity in the Soviet zone. The entire mass of currency notes which were cancelled in the western zone threatened to pour into Berlin and the Soviet zone of occupation in Germany. Then there cannot be any answers but basically the 3 that's provided. Now take note, 1 mark, 1 mark, 1 mark, but we only need 2 answers. Basically, let's go to the next question. The next question explains the concept monetary reform in the context of the Berlin Zone in 1948, meaning the concept must be explained. Monetary reform. What does that mean actually? Let's look at the answer. Remember, concepts are not in the sources. You must have studied it basically. So the answer is the introduction of a new financial system currency, Deutschmark, by the Western zones in the zones that excluded the Soviet part of Germany. Now take note, this is in context of the Berlin zone. So now we need to mention the Deutschmark basically. If it was basically monetary reform in your own words, then the introduction of a new financial currency basically. So that would be the answer for in own words. But in the context, the Deutschmark must be utilized also. Now let's go to 1.3.3. Why, according to the source, did the Soviet command believe that the danger of the disruption of economic activities of the Soviet zone and of the Berlin was not eliminated? So let's look at the answer there. It's an extraction again. The United States, Britain, France continue to maintain in Berlin their special currency. Mark allocation 1 times 2, meaning 1 answer, 2 marks. 1.3.4, comment on the limitations of the source. So you must comment on how the source is limited. So now we need to go back to the notes that we spoke about earlier. What is how we should answer limitations questions basically. The source only portrays the Soviet command's viewpoint. Remember, we spoke about bias. So now it's only one side. So we can clearly see there. So that is already 2 marks basically. So we cannot say it only shows one side. We must say the source only portrays the Soviet commands. Then the source is critical or biased to financial reforms in Western. Take note, it explains in Western control zones basically. So it's explaining it. Then any other relevant responses. Now take note, this is 2 marks. So when we look at the 2 marks, it gives us the 4 marks basically. Let's go to the next part. 1.4, it is a compare question. Now we need to compare it. Consult sources 1b and 1c. Comment on how source 1b differs. Take note, we're looking at differences from source 1c regarding reasons given by the USA and Soviet Union for remaining as occupying powers in Berlin in 1948. Mark your location 2 times 2. Let's look at the answers. In source 1b, take note, in source 1b, the USA justifies its occupation of Berlin based on the formal agreements, while in source 1c, Berlin lies geographically in the Soviet zone, basically. So we can see the contradiction, basically, how the West tried to protect themselves by giving their reasons, but geographically it lies in the Soviet zone. Let's go to the next answer. So this, because the learner has indicated what is happening in 1b and in 1c, so that gives us the 2 marks basically. So source 1b, The USA justifies its occupation of Berlin based on the formal agreements, whereas 1C states wanted to achieve economic recovery, dominating of the Western zone, basically. Then source, let's go to the next bullet, source 1B. The US government states that it won't abandon the western sector of Berlin as it has a responsibility for the well-being of its people. Well, in source 1C, the Soviet government made an assurance to protect uh, the interests of the entire German population and not the Soviet zone only, meaning both sides basically. So now we can clearly see that this gives us 2 marks. This gives us 2 marks. How much do we need? We only need 2 answers, and that will give us the 4 marks that we actually should utilize. Now let's go to the last source, source 1D. This source below titled London Under the Linden Trees by S.J. Ray was published in the U.S. Kansas City Star newspaper on 2nd December 1948. It depicts Stalin cutting Berlin into 2 parts, basically. We can see the first arrow, it points to Stalin cutting. Then the second one, it is the article that's on the floor. It says a Russian agreement to mediate, refers to Russian Stalin having the final say in ending Allied joint administration of Berlin, basically. Now let's go to the questions. Explain the symbolic representation of the 3 leaders seated next to each other. Take note, next to each other in the context of the Cold War. Mark your location 1 times 1. Let's look at the answers that is provided. The USA, Britain, and France ruled over Western Berlin. 3 combined zones of USA, Britain, and France formed West Berlin, basically, and West Germany at the same time also. Leading members of capitalists in the Cold War against communism. So the key here is explain the symbolic representation of the 3 leaders. So it means, what does it mean of them being together? Then the Western Allies were alarmed by the action of the Soviet leader in dividing Berlin into 2 parts, basically. So now we can see they are blaming Stalin for dividing Berlin into 2 parts. 1.5.2, why did Russia, under leadership of Stalin, want to have a final say in the administration of Berlin, basically? Mark your location 1 times 2. Berlin was located in the Russian Soviet zone. Russia wanted to preserve communism, wanted to stop capitalism from influencing Berlin as a city. Any other relevant responses? So when we look at the mark your location 1, we only need 1 answer for this particular question. Now let's go to the paragraph question. Very important paragraph question. Using the information, relevant sources, own knowledge. Write a paragraph of about 8 lines. Take note, not less than 80 words. It says above 80 words, not less than 80 words, explaining how Berlin became a focal point of Cold War tension between the Soviet Union and the United States of America in the 1948. Mark your location, 8 marks. Now let's look at the answer. It must be interpreted, evaluated, and the answers are as follows. Now it is in bullet form because of presentation. When you write it, it must be in a paragraph. In bullet form is just for presentation, but it must be in a paragraph, basically. So the first answer, the European Advisory Commission planned the division of Germany into 3 zones. Indicate where it comes from at the end, source 1A. It held that Germany was divided into 4 different zones for each of the victorious powers, source 1A. Western Berlin flourished as a result of financial assistance from the USA, own knowledge. The city of Berlin, though located deep in the Soviet zone, was also divided and administered by the joint 4 countries, source 1A. So now we can see, learners, apology. So now we can see that from source 1A, we retrieved 3 questions. There is no such thing as source 1A2, source 1B2, source 1C2. No, there's no such thing. It doesn't work like that when it comes to the paragraph. Then The second last bullet, the governments of the USA, Great Britain, and France wrote to complain when the Soviet government blockade traffic from entering and accessing Berlin from source 1B. Western powers combined their zones and form West Berlin, own knowledge, basically. Next one, the US government regarded this blockade as a threat and committed to resist it, source 1B. The USA government displayed willingness to settle disputes with the Soviet government by negotiations, source 1B. The Soviet government was convinced the blockade was caused by the introduction of a special currency by the Western powers for the zones in West Berlin, source 1C. The Soviet government also indicated that it was willing to administer the whole of Berlin alone if necessary, 1C. The Soviet government desired to spread its spheres of interest, meaning own knowledge. The city of Berlin was divided into two parts by Stalin, 1D. The other three powers leaders were taken by surprise at Stalin's action of dividing the city, 1D. Any other relevant responses is also needed, but it must be in the context of the question being asked. So learners, this is what we call now a tabular question that will be provided to you basically. So I've gone through the content. I've gone through the questions that were set up. I've gone through the answers also. So it's important that you just rewind and you just go through this and you refresh your memory bank basically. And then you should answer this basically on your own also at the same time. Now, very important that our next lesson now, when we meet again next week, the same time, will basically be the extension of the Cold War, and that is what we call the SA Vietnam basically. So you can see on the 20th of March, we'll meet again the same time, the extension of the Cold War, and it will be the war in Vietnam basically. Learners, thank you for joining us. And next week, I am actually very excited because we will be talking about how to sustain a line of argument at large also. So thank you for joining us and see you next time. Bye.